as we're seeing them, and you must be seeing them, you're a very young man, is the animating idea of our time is that all of human interaction is boiled down to an epic struggle between the oppressed and their oppressors.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. And my guest today is Mike Gonzalez, who has just written a new book called Gen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It. He's the co-author with Catherine Gorka. Mike, pleasure to be with you.
Great to be here, Tom. I'm a great admirer of your organization. I've been up to Wilmington for the dinners, so I'm a long time fan.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you talking about your new book. Congratulations. How did you, before we actually even come to speaking about how you wrote the book in particular, tell me more about you. This is our first time meeting. How did you arrive at writing this book? What's your sort of career and personal trajectory?
So let me reverse the order. I have for some time now been writing books warning Americans that what we're seeing is actually a concerted attempt at changing the culture and changing society. It is not happening. It is not happenstance. It is not coincidence. And I've written a couple of books on the subject. And this is the fullest of the. And this one is co-authored with Catherine Katie Gorka, who's a former White House official, has a very good strategic mind, which paired very well with the kind of writing that I have done. She's also written books. I was almost a journalist. I was a journalist for almost 20 years. I mainly with the Wall Street Journal, 10 of them with the edit page of the Wall Street Journal overseas. One of them as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I covered Wall Street. Before that, I spent 6 years with Agence France Presse all over the world. I've been, I covered Manuel Noriega in Panama, was arrested and kicked out, put in prison. I traveled with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1989. I lived in Hong Kong for 8 years. I covered the transition to democracy in Korea. The introduction of the euro. I lived in Brussels for close to 6 years. So I have a vast, plus I was born overseas myself. I was born in Cuba, spent part of my childhood in Spain, and then came to the U.S. when I was 14 in the early 70s. So that's really the trajectory of my life. I'm outward oriented. I have been looking at foreign policy and foreign events for many years. And then I realized that I had to turn my gaze inward. I had a very interesting conversation with my daughter when she was younger, about 4 or 5 years ago. We were at donuts after Mass at church. And she said, she really surprised me because she said, we'll get it, Daddy. You have been fighting America's enemies for a long time, and they used to be foreign, and now you're fighting the enemy within, and that makes you more uncomfortable. And I said, wow, what a great insight. I said, well, yeah, because they have constitutional rights, and we can't ignore the fact that you can be a communist in the United States as long as you use peaceful means. You just have to expose what they're doing and trust in the American people to get it and fight back.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, that's the call. I'm curious about this language about enemies, because this is something I think we're hearing more and more of. And some people I talk to, whether they're on the right and they don't really like this language, or they're on the left and they don't like maybe that the right is starting to embrace this sort of, and it's not just language, but this language speaks to larger ideas about what it means to be American, what it means to live with fellow citizens who disagree. We've done some conversations on this podcast with people who are, encouraging greater civility in our discourse, understanding the dignity of all human beings as the basis of all of our rights, natural and constitutional, like you were mentioning. I'm just curious what you think as someone who spent a long time looking out at enemies foreign and now coming to make this sort of turn towards looking at enemies domestic. What's the sort of, I guess personally, even on the one hand, there's a tendency, maybe, I wouldn't want to call a fellow American an enemy, but at the same time, you do have to sort of notice what's going on and notice these trends. So how do you, think through that?
Those are excellent questions, Tom. We're living through regime change, or through regime politics. There are people who are at war with the American regime, or to be more specific, with the Constitution of 1787. They want to overturn it, and in many ways, people like Charles Kessler at the Claremont Institute say that we're already living with two constitutions, and that's one of the reasons for our instability. We are in some way living in two constitutional regimes. One, as I said, the Constitution of 1887. The other one, which I have in jest, but more seriously also called the Combahee River Collective Constitution, which is a constitution that, for the people who hate the original Constitution and want to overturn it. I don't think enemies is too strong a word when, for example, Alicia Garza says this is one of the architects of Black Lives Matter, and a product of all this thinking, says that what needs to be done is dismantle the organizing principle of society. And in fact, that is being said. And that's not just them who are. The woman that Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, just appointed last week as the top DEI person at the State Department also says that we have to dismantle societal norms, that we have to dismantle. And I can tell you, I have this, I don't want to look up the story, I just wrote a column on it. I can quote her verbatim if you want me to. And she says we have to dismantle pretty much a cultural matrix of this country. And I am sworn to prevent. As somebody who came here as an immigrant, who saw America as an escape hatchet from real tyranny, and who was fortunate enough to come here and benefit from the great promise of this country, who has spent many, many decades in this country, the decades that I was not overseas as a foreign correspondent, but even those decades living overseas, I was already an American. And this is still the land that, as Lincoln said, the last best hope of Earth. And I think it needs improvement. Obviously, America is not perfect. Nothing on Earth is ever going to be perfect. It needs improvement, like all earthly things do. But I think dismantling the American system, dismantling the American regime, dismantling the American nation, the way we do things, and the American Constitution, both with the cap C and the small c, both the Constitution that the framers wrote and the way we're constituted as a society with a small c, that is something that I don't think we should do. And I think the American people, everyday Americans across the land, get that. They benefit from this great country. They love this great country. They're unabashedly patriotic. And so that is really why we need to, while being completely aware 24/7 that people who espouse these ideas have constitutional rights as long as they're doing things peacefully, I think we need to say, look, this is what they want to do. And I'm going to quote them saying these things. The New York Times will not quote them. The Washington Post will not quote them. The networks will not quote them. So I'm going to quote them. I'm going to use the footnote, and I'm going to give it in the proper context and say this is the things they want to do. So, yeah, we could say adversaries if you want. I don't think that Alicia Garza or the other architects of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, or the people who trained them and recruited them, like Eric Mann, Harmony Goldberg, the other people that are highlighting in my book, Next Gen Marxism, like Will Ayers, I don't think they would shy away from saying that they're enemies of the American system. So they say they're enemies of the American system. Those of us who defend the American system have to be ready to recognize that we have a fight of ideas in our hands.
Gotcha. Tell me more about the structure of the book. How is it sort of organized?
So I think we have 8 chapters in which we go. 9 chapters and an introduction. So 10 chapters. We go through first of all, we introduce the book, Next Gen Marxism, by saying, look, everything we're looking at, the country is changed in many fundamental ways and very rapidly. Everything from the rules of romance to the segregated bathrooms and segregated sports teams to the idea that we should be promoted and hired based on our merit and our character and our willingness to work and put in the long hours, rather than the race, the color of our skin, our national origin, which is something that we did for a very long time, and it was wrong, and we decided not to do it anymore in the 1950s and 60s, and we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't go back to making decisions based on race. And yet, this is what we have been doing again now for the last 10 years. Anything from the idea that children should be mutilated, and calling that gender affirming care, allowing them to make these decisions, or having adults do these things to them, which would have been not just far-fetched but grotesque, which is what they are. We say, why are all these changes happening? And we say, well, there is a concerted effort to change the American cultural matrix, change the American conceptual superstructure, and it's by people who say they want to do that, and they're Marxists. They're not. This is a Marxism that has evolved, has changed from the Marxism of the Manifesto that I'm going to sneeze. That Marx and Engels wrote in 1848, or the Communism of Capital that Marx wrote in 1867. It's no longer. We can go through that, and I'd love to explain it as well. It became a cultural Marxism in the 1920s and 30s. These ideas in Europe, and then these ideas came from Europe here. They flowered in the United States in the 1960s, and then we added some very uniquely American elements, such as race, an obsession with sex and race, community organizing, and then in the 21st century, we've also added the use of vast Marxist networks that span the globe, which really helped the BLM, shock troops, and then social media. And that is what goes from Marxist economic Marxism to cultural Marxism to next gen Marxism. And then we give in the final chapter a chapter on solutions, because the American people want to fight this. The American people, a raft of policy changes and cultural changes were implemented in the last 4 years because the gatekeepers of our cultural institutions were intimidated by the 2020 BLM riots. The American people do not like these changes, and I think our leaders, be them political.
Gotcha. And who are your... at ISI, we pay a lot of credence to the notion that ideas have consequences. Richard Weaver's famous book perhaps sparked the conservative movement, the modern conservative movement intellectually. But I think one of the shortcomings of this way of thinking is that the ideas just have a life of their own, which in a way they do. But in another respect, we tend to underemphasize the role that institutions or that individual actors or small groups of actors play in bringing these ideas into fruition and affecting these ideas into actual material lived reality, so to speak. So who are your sort of key players or fellow travelers for affecting this? I'm familiar with the idea of the long march to the institutions, which is, I think, what you're talking about. So who are the people that we're talking about, and what are they each doing?
I'm talking about, but you ask excellent questions, Tom. First of all, I'm sure you're not a stranger to the name John Maynard Keynes, and as he himself said, that we're controlled by the ideas of some defunct philosopher or economist. We may think that we're doing things on our own because of our own ideas, but we're actually following the ideas of a dead philosopher or a dead economist. And in fact, that applies to him very well. You can, if you today are a policymaker who believes in deficit spending to stimulate economic growth, or you believe in raising taxes to do the opposite, to throttle economic growth, maybe because you fear inflation is coming, you are a Keynesian. Even if you have never read John Maynard Keynes, and if you say to them, well, you're a Keynesian, they will say, like, I have no idea what Keynesian is, or Keynesianism. I don't know who Keynes was. I just believe in these ideas. If you're implementing them in policy, you're a Keynesian. Or, for example, if you say a rose by any other color would smell just as sweet, you're quoting Shakespeare, even if you don't know you're quoting Shakespeare. In fact, our language, the English language, is just suffused with Shakespeare and the King James Bible. We're constantly, because that is the cultural matrix.
Right.
What we're seeing is an attempt at replacing that cultural matrix. And that is why we can say, my co-author, Katie Gorka, and I can say, that's next gen Marxism, and those ideas are next gen Marxism, even though people say, like, I'm not a Marxist. What are you talking about? I inherited a pile from my father. I'm not about to give that up. In fact, those people who inherited a pile from their father are most likely to be influenced by these ideas. And it boils down to many things. But as we're seeing them, and you must be seeing them, you're a very young man, is the animating idea of our time is that all of human interaction is boiled down to an epic struggle between the oppressed and their oppressors. And we see that with students or young people demonstrating in support of terrorists, Palestinian terrorists who committed atrocities on October 7th last year, 2023, and ignoring the plight of the women they gang raped, or they killed the children they killed, burned to death, because they have simplified the struggle to that. They have put the Palestinians in the oppressed category and Israeli Jews in the oppressor category. So you have this aberrant behavior of supporting one against the other because of these ideas, because of the idea that has been inculcated in their mind of everything. And that, Tom, you probably do know this, comes from the very first page of the manifesto, where Marx and his sugar daddy Engels say all of human history can be boiled down to the struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. It says that, at least in the English translation. I don't read German, and I've never read the manifesto in German because I don't read German. But in the English translation, that's what it says. So that is the quintessential Marxist idea, which is the operative belief in our day. We live in an age of victimhood because of that. So that is how next-gen Marxism plays out in our lives and control our lives. But let me go through this, if I can see if I can do it in 3 minutes. The Marxism of Marx and Engels was purely economic. They believed that the material forces of production, the change in the material forces of production would determine the pace of revolution. They believed that the worker was going to be the fighter, constantly trying to overthrow the bourgeoisie. In Capital, which he wrote in 1967, Marx wrote that the worker, the mission of the proletariat, that is the working class, was to overthrow the capital owning class, the bourgeoisie. And there's no successful revolution between the 1848 and 1917, when it first succeeds for the first time after more than half a century in Russia, in the Russian Empire, in the creation of the Soviet Union. And then when Italian and German communists tried to replicate this in Italy and Germany between 1919 and 1921, they fail. They fail miserably in both countries. And these are two industrialized societies, unlike Russia at the time. And they fail because the German and Italian worker did not go along with the communists. The German and Italian worker liked the things that Marx had said had to be abolished. He liked his family, a lot. He liked his children and his wife. He liked God. He worshipped God. Marx said it had to be abolished. He liked it. You can't really speak of nation state at the time because a lot of them lived in empires, in European empires. But he liked his country in the small patriotism way. They were patriotic, lovers of the land of their births, and they liked what private property they had. They didn't want the government to expropriate it. These are all things that Marx had said had to be abolished. So these German and Italian thinkers in Italy is Antonio Gramsci, the founder of Italy's Communist Party. In Germany, you have people like Max Horkheimer and Karl Korsch. And in Hungary, you have George Lukács. They come up with the idea that the worker had false consciousness. The worker had bought into the cultural beliefs of his oppressor. The capital, the owner of capital, the oppressor no longer needed to use violence. The worker was oppressing himself. The worker did not realize he was a victim and oppressed. He had false consciousness, had to be convinced of the fact that he was a victim. And the worker also did not realize that the rich and powerful had created these norms and traditions to keep themselves rich and powerful. So they had to undertake a trajectory of infiltrating the institutions and indoctrinating the young. That's called the Long March of the Institutions, which people wrongly ascribed to Gramsci, but it was really Rudy Duch. I'm blanking on his name. I've written his name 100 times. Rudy Ducek, who a Marcusean student, a student of Herbert Marcuse, Rudy Duchka, who came up with the phrase in 1967. But it's a Gramscian idea. The Long March to the Institutions is a Gramscian idea. That's why people say this Gramsci is actually Rudy Duchka, a West German radical, very violent student. And he writes to Marcuse. Marcuse says, "Brilliant. This is Herbert Marcuse I'm talking about. I remember one of the German intellectuals who's come over to the U.S. And he says, brilliant, this is the way to go." And by the way, but the Long March, that was a little inside joke. He was referring to Mao's Long March in the snows of China in the 1930s when Mao was fighting the nationalists. Mao was leading the Communist Party of China, and eventually Mao wins in 1949 and overthrows the nationalist government. So that's a little inside joke which they always have. So look, we're communists. We know each other to be communists. So who are the most influential people? Very quickly, Gramsci has to be number one. I would say after that, Karl Korsch is a German thinker, very influential. He's the one that first comes up with the term vulgar Marxism. He says that thinking in terms of economic determinism is vulgar. He also comes up with critical in the sense of overthrowing the intellectual infrastructure. Max Horkheimer, very important. George Lukács, very important. Marcuse, extremely important because he's very influential here in the United States. And then we have a number of people, if you want to get into critical legal theory, because they have American children. I'm talking intellectual children. And then you have people like Duncan Kennedy, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw.
Right.
These were all Richard Delgado, Mary Matsuda. These are people who are very influential, who take these ideas and make them American, and they become next gen Marxists in our view.
Gotcha. I'd be curious to hear about this might be potentially an observation. Here's an observation. What has happened today in corporate boardrooms, large multinational corporations, American corporations, and they are pushing more or less this sort of, you'd call it next gen Marxism. I don't know how closely they overlap with just the idea of wokeness, which is, I think, picked up like a popular, like people, that's a popular word now. Everyone sort of, it's not an academic term per se, but and they are promoting this sort of cultural counter-revolution through their massive advertising networks and there's a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars built into DEI infrastructures. I'm familiar with Stephen Sukup's book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. And so I'd be curious to hear about how this is Marxist, because on the one hand, it is sort of this Gramscian strain of thought run through American institutions. But at the same time, this is an attempt to change the cultural infrastructure to help make this sort of economic and civilizational revolution and a perpetual revolution in Marx's idea possible. And so it just seems like, why is it Marxism as opposed to just the idea of liberalism, and that this is something that's being parroted or basically used as a cover for capitalists who are actively pushing this, even though it would lead to the destruction of their own ability to make money to enjoy material and social success.
So you mentioned several things in there. Let me parse through them. Steve Sukup's book is very, very good. I'm a big fan of Steve, and Vivek Ramaswamy also wrote about this. I'll be seeing him next week. I think what you have is several things. One is, by the way, that you use the term woke, and I want to. So woke comes from African American slang, being awake to the oppression that is taking place in American society, they say. And what it is then to be awake to the epic struggle between the oppressor and the oppressor and how people are being oppressed. Woke is really about this simple matrix that they've given us, that everything must be fitted into the oppressed versus the oppressor. That is what woke is being awake to, but they believe it. They believe that these things, that people, that we live in systems of oppression, that America is an oppressive society, that we have systemic racism. I have mentioned to you that that I was a foreign correspondent and I was born overseas. I have lived at least a year in 7 different countries, almost equally distributed between this hemisphere, Europe, and Asia. And I can tell you, I can compare and contrast. And I have lived less than a year in double-digit countries. I lived a month in Kabul. I lived 3 months in Pakistan. I've lived all over the place. I lived a year in Paris. We're not an oppressive society, and it beggars belief that it needs to be said. We don't live on the systemic racism. We have racists. We have ugly, rank racists who live among us, and you and I have met them. We know who they are. We know them almost instantly, and we have very good civil rights law that prevents them from causing much damage, because a lot of the decisions that they would make would be illegal and actionable under the law. But the Marxist American ideological grandchildren will tell you that the individual races does not matter. Forget the individual races. What matters is the racism in everyday life, in the way we walk, the clothes they wear, the cars we drive. And this is a family podcast, and I cannot use the terms that I want to use to describe this. But it's hogwash, let's put it now. I think that as these ideas were taught in universities, especially in the Ivy Leagues and the top universities, the top 20 universities, these students then took them to the workplace and they entered the C-suite. And if you go to Columbia, you go to Harvard, or you go to Cornell, you're going to enter the C-suite at an accelerated pace. And they have taken a hold there where they never succeeded on the factory floor, because the people on the factory floor have common sense. They wanted better working conditions, and they wanted maybe a week on the Jersey Shore, 2 weeks on the Jersey Shore, but they loved their country, and they did not. In fact, the reason why we're here is because the worker refused to fight, refused to be cannon fodder in the ideological struggle, and so there's several elements at work here. One is that, as you know, because you and I have studied American history, bad stuff happened. We have a bad history of racial relations. We had centuries of slavery, and then we had 100 years of Jim Crow. We had, we had a very tough history, and that has left, rather than just learn it and resolve never to let this evil enter our lives again, and to fight against any bias that we may have, because we have to be very always on guard against any racial bias that we may harbor. Rather than decide, okay, well, we're not going to be like this anymore. In government, in private sector, cannot act on the basis of race and make decisions on the basis of race. A lot of people, what they have done is they're imbued with great guilt.
Right.
And this guilt is put to work. And it's not just me saying that. Patrice Couleurs, one of the architects of Black Lives Matter, has said that. Has said that the money that they made in 2020 was a lot of white guilt money.
Yeah, for sure.
And by the way, that was $100 million of white guilt money, if you want to use her expression. And Nicole Hannah-Jones it's also on the record as saying, I want to use white guilt, liberal guilt, as my tool. So you have a little bit of that. And then I think Vivek's point, I haven't read his book in a while, but I think the point of Vivek's book was that a lot of them, maybe a lot of the Larry Finks of this world, have just used this as a front to have labor practices that leave a lot to be desired. And it is true that if a company, for example, is faced with a civil rights charge, with a civil rights accusation, if you have a DEI training, if you have instituted in your company DEI training, that is actually in your favor. You can show this. No, not me. Look at this perfect training that we have. That we're anti-racist and trying to fight systemic racism within our company. So we have given these incentives for these bad ideas to enter the workplace, and they have entered the workplace. And what we need to do is help Americans who do not want to put on their desk, I'm an ally, a sign that says I'm an ally, or do not want to meet with the affinity group. That means people of their own race or national provenance. They don't want to meet with them after hours, because they think that they just want to meet with the people they like. And maybe, I'm Cuban by origin. There's a lot of Cuban Americans I don't like. I don't want to meet them after 5 in my affinity group and have cafecito with them. I'd rather pick my friends based on other ideas. I like many other Cuban Americans. But so because these ideas have entered the workplace and have entered the university, we need to give everyday Americans the policy solutions to fight, to be able to say no HR, to face up to HR, the HR commissar, the DEI commissar, and say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I have the Constitution on my side. The Constitution protects me against compelled speech.
Yes, maybe we could turn to some of these solutions. I mean, one thing, just as I was listening to you speak, that it really is pathetic to see so many people with, and it's not just white guilt, but it's once you buy into this paradigm that we're talking about of oppressor versus oppressed, with a preference for the oppressed as against the oppressor, which, I'm Catholic, so we have a sort of idea of a preferential option for the poor, or taking care of the lowliest among us. However, that's very different than saying that those higher among us are bad or evil, or that it is actively a good thing or desirable. But I also think that drives a lot of the sort of social and political pathologies. Like, everyone wants to be weird, or be able to say that there's something wrong with them. Because, like you were saying, you want to be a victim, and the idea of being a victor, really, it comes to all of your gains are ill-gotten, which it's farcical. It's just a canard. But getting to the policy solutions, because on the one hand, it's coming through the corporate boardrooms and it's coming through education. But there's also this political and legal infrastructure, and Supreme Court cases on disparate impact, like was it Griggs v. Duke Power, that instantiates all of this stuff into law. So what do you and Katie prescribe for legal, political, jurisprudential solutions towards combating this sort of thing?
So first of all, I want to say that as Catholics, we probably say at least 3, if not more, times a day, forgive us our trespasses if we forgive those who have trespassed against us, and that's the one in the Lord's Prayer. That's the one I mean the most. We believe in forgiveness. We believe in salvation. We believe in things that are not part of this other paradigm that they want to force down on us. And we also believe when we want to help the poor, that is, if you want to translate that to Washington speak, that is a means-tested urge. Yes, and I'm all for means-testing help. We have already agreed as a society, or a societal consensus, that we're going to have means-tested help to those who have fallen through the cracks. Nobody says, "Oh no, we're not gonna." We want to live in a society where the devil take the hindmost. No, we don't live in that society, and nobody wants to live in that society. So what do we do? I mean, well, you work with. There are many things. You work with different states. Right now, obviously, the federal government is not going to be great help. As I mentioned earlier in this conversation, the Biden State Department just appointed the head of the DEI, who really sounds like she wants to dismantle society. Her last name is Carr Johnson, and you work with the states to on the DEI front, for example, like Florida and Texas have banned the use of DEI in universities, state universities, and I think that's a great idea because it's not just the fact that DEI does not work, that all the studies, the McKinsey study that said that DEI is actually good for the bottom line has been debunked recently. It said it cannot be replicated. And it's 4 McKinsey studies that are not replicable. And the supporters of DEI always mention the McKinsey study. So it doesn't work, but it also, they are unconstitutional ideas because let's just unpack DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You, Tom, I don't know who you are, but I want to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion in the traditional meaning. But what it has come to mean, diversity is now racial quotas. Supreme Court says they're illegal. Inclusion means language codes. That's against the First Amendment. That's also so inclusion means kids that show up with a pro-life hat at the Smithsonian get kicked out, or some dude wearing a Jesus T-shirt at a mall is kicked out by the mall cops. And equity is the worst because it's the functional opposite of equality. It says that you must treat people, Americans, differently because of their race, and that just flies in the face of the 14th Amendment. So that's the reason why the state legislatures are having quite a great deal of success getting rid of driving DEI from university systems where they have really mushroomed, adding to the already inflationary cost of getting an education, and they're huge. And like not just for example, at the University of Michigan, there was a study here done on Heritage which shows the University of Michigan has many more DEI officials than it has history teachers. It's also true for universities in Virginia. It's also true for UVA. It's also true for George Mason. Virginia is not. Virginia is a purple state. The 3 highest elected statewide officials are all Republicans. And the legislature is barely controlled by Democrats, but that's the definition of a purple state. And yet its universities are really captured by DEI officers. George Mason, which gets his reputation as being a conservative university, has a huge DEI problem. So you fight it at that level. I'm currently with a colleague writing a paper on why we need to act against ethnic studies. Ethnic studies it divides. It's meant to divide the country. It's not a unifying. It's being sold in Minnesota today. I've just been looking because I'm writing about it on Minnesota's social studies standards. They're very divisive, and they use Gramscian concept constantly all over. The standards mention the narrative, the word narrative, in the oppressed versus oppressor at least 60 times. So you also provide help for Americans, like what President Trump did in driving DEI from the federal workforce and from federal contractors. I think it's something that if a conservative ever were to live in the White House again, that's something that we need to do again. We need to make sure that federal contractors and in the federal workforce does not have to live by decent constitutional rules. We need to help everyday Americans who want to fight this, who do not agree with the cultural changes that have been put in place. Give them help, because when I travel the country extensively, this week I'm traveling to New York, next week I'm going to California and Texas, and when I speak to groups, and a lot of them say, it's very easy for you to say that. You can say these things because you work for the Heritage Foundation, but I can't. I'll get fired. If I don't do what HR tells me to do, I'll get fired, or I will not be promoted.
Right. And
we need to help Americans that are in that situation. We need to much more, for example, in the sexual. We haven't talked about the sexual, the grotesquerie that is happening. We need to make sure that minors are not being operated on. That this is not a decision that an adult can make for a minor, nor that a minor can make for himself or herself. But this has a lifelong impact. They're going to have to go to a doctor for the rest of their lives. They're going to be, probably their fertility will be affected, or they will be infertile, or they're going to have to live all the decades of their lives without feeling any sexual pleasure. This is just bad stuff. We don't let children smoke, and yet we let them alter their organs. How did that come to pass? So we need to work at that level as well. There are many things that need to be done. They're laid out in the final chapter of our book.
Awesome. I got one final question for you as we're sort of coming to the end. How feasible, or what levers or what mechanisms would we need in order to do what you're talking about? So the state level, we've already seen sort of this stuff play out. So that seems to make sense to me. Ron DeSantis has, I think, offered a compelling model.
Right. Yes, I agree.
Other red state governors are following suit. And then, of course, there's always the potential problem that Florida could flip blue. I don't see that as a short-term possibility, but as a longer-term goal. That could always happen, and then it happens in the reverse. But that's the sort of rough and tumble of state democracies. But what about at a federal level? How is this possible in terms of pushing back on, giant corporations that are actively pushing this sort of thing? They're complicit in the sort of revolutionary counter-hegemony that's happening. So how feasible is the task that we're talking about? What would we need to do?
So this is we have a federal system, thank God for that. We have 50 laboratories of democracy. I'm a strong believer in here. We here at Heritage are strong believers that the natural sovereign of education is the family, and the family is reflected best in the school districts, and we have between 10,000 and 14,000 school districts in the country. And then after that, we have the state legislature. But it stops there. There is no role for the federal government in education. I would strongly recommend, and we do, to get rid of the Department of Education. It was not started by Hamilton. It was not started by James Polk. It was not started by William McKinley. It was started by Jimmy Carter. Not within your lifetime, but definitely within mine. So that is a state issue, education. With ESG, I like a lot what a lot of the state attorneys general have been doing in Kentucky, Tennessee, etc. I think West Virginia, in which they are saying to BlackRock and to the other money managers, if you're going to not invest in our fossil fuel industries, we're not going to let you invest in our pension funds. We're not going to let you manage the money of our pension funds, and then you begin to hurt them that way. This is why so many of the four major large money managers, BlackRock and the others are trying to at least drop the rhetoric. They have to do more than drop the rhetoric. They have to try drop the action. But this is a strong role for the federal government. The president has the bully pulpit. The president, she or he, can use that bully pulpit to say, we're no longer going to be doing this to ourselves. We have a good country with a good culture. We're not going to be practicing cultural genocide. We're not going to dismantle the United States, nor its culture, nor its conceptual superstructure, nor its cultural matrix. We're not going to be doing any of these things. What we're going to do is constantly improve these United States. We're going to be trying to drive out bad things such as racism. We're going to have good education. We're going to try to make sure that our children are reading and doing math at grade level of all races. We're going to a president who speaks that way from the White House is a very powerful thing. And I think we have to go back to that. And we have to go back and the things like Congress, like, for example, the military. That we haven't talked about the military. The military, they're going through one of their worst recruitment periods in history because they've turned off and they've gone completely woke. They've gone completely next Gen Marxist. And that can be helped by the federal government, only the federal government. The president and the Congress can do that. And so yes, the Congress has an oversight role that has to use. It's already using it forcefully. I even though the Republicans have a very small minority, teeny tiny, there's some. Not every Republican is great, believe me, Tom. But some heads of committees, I must commend in this case the head of the Educational and Workplace, Virginia Fox. That's a great committee that she leads in the House. She's done stellar work. She's the one that called in the presidents of Harvard and Penn and MIT with the consequences that we saw. So we need to have these things, but we need to work at every level from the school board. I believe in a state like Arizona, there's 200 school boards, or Nevada, I forget, one of the two, to the local government, to the district, to the county, to the state legislature, to the federal government. You need to work at all these levels in order to drive this out because we have been in a state of trance since 2020, in a state of mass hysteria. If not since Ferguson 2014 or Trayvon Martin when BLM gets founded, at least since 2020 when all of this gets put on steroids. And we need to wake up from this state of mass hysteria and work on the things that really matter. There are real racial disparities that we need to tackle. The racial disparities are real. We need to get to the root causes of it. One root cause is family formation. We need to address that. Be courageous and address that, and that can be done at the federal level.
Well, great. A return to normalcy would certainly be welcome. But yeah, Mike, thanks so much. The book is Next Gen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It. We will put it in our show notes. But if people want to follow other of your work, where should they look?
Look, they can look me up on X, formerly Twitter, at Gonzalez. That's my name in Latin, Gundisalvus. Just look Mike Gonzalez at Twitter. Come to the Heritage Foundation. My book is Next Gen Marxism. Is sold on Amazon. Is doing really well. I know you can see it. It's kind of flipped. It actually sold out on Amazon. They ran out of stock.
Congratulations.
I know that's a good problem to have. But they rushed new book, new inventory from the warehouse, and now Amazon is stocked again. And the book has been selling really well. I'm very happy. Katie, my co-author, and I have been really happy with that. So on Amazon you can find my books, but especially this one, Next Gen Marxism by me and Katie Gorka, and heritage.org. My employer puts out really good policy solutions. That's the business that we're in, policy formulation.
Well, excellent. Congratulations again on the book, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.